Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
A reading from the Gospel of Mark. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
Jesus, when you gonna wake up? When you gonna wake up and calm this raging sea? Jesus, when you gonna wake up? When you gonna wake up? How can you sleep when we're in need? Just one word from the Maker, and all the waves would be made still. Just one touch from the Healer, and all will be made well. See, Jesus, when you gonna wake up? When you gonna wake up? How can you sleep when we're in need? Just one word from the Maker, and all the waves will be made still. Just one touch from the Healer, and all will be made well. Just one word from the Maker, and all the waves will be made still. Just one touch from the Healer, and feet when we're in need. So won't you rise up? 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 Won't you rise up?
Let's pray. For all who are vulnerable and afraid, for Ukraine's people, for trans kids and their families in Texas, for all suffering amid war and violence, for all who feel forgotten, grant them courage, strength, and the true peace of knowing that they are beloved. God, hear our prayers. For all who abuse their power, for those drunk on arrogance, for those who wield their strength with disregard for human dignity, for those inflamed by deceptive pride, grant them humility, restraint, and the true peace of knowing that they are beloved. God, hear our prayers. For all who feel overwhelmed, for those who want to do something yet feel powerless, for those trying to bear witness, for those who are flailing, grant them wisdom, comfort that is not complacency, and the true peace of knowing that they are beloved. God, hear our prayers. Amen.
Heavenly Father, you always amaze me. Let your kingdom come in my world and in my life. Give me the food I need to live through today. And forgive me as I forgive the people who wrong me. Lead me far from temptation, but deliver me from the evil one. I look out the window, the birds are composing, and not a note is out of tune or out of place. I walk to the meadow and stare at the flowers, better dressed than any girl on her wedding day. So why should I worry? Why do I freak out? God knows what I need. You know what I need. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. Your love is, your love is, love is strong. The kingdom of heavens is now advancing. this broken town. The kingdom of the heavens is buried treasure. Would you sell yourself to buy the one you found? Two things you've told me: that you are strong and you love me. Yes, you love me. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. Your love is, your love is, your love is strong. Oh God in heaven, hallowed be thy name above all names. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us weary sinners. Keep us far from our vices and deliver us from these prisons.
There are many ways we collaborate with each other to be the church we're called to be and to serve how we serve. And our contributing financially is one of the most important of those ways. If you want to help fund and sustain what we get to do together, go to crosspoint.org/contribute to see the many simple ways that you can do so. You can even text crosspointenc to 77977 to receive a link to get started now. Thank you for your partnership in the work we do together.
Hey Crosspointe, really good to be with you again today. Now up front, just a quick reminder. If you're local to the Raleigh-Durham area, next week, March 13th, we'll be gathering back inside on Crosspointe's campus at 10 a.m., which is also the same day we spring clocks forward, so make sure you don't forget to do that. Last week, I talked about some of the programming changes, mask policies, and what to expect in our Sunday morning gathering in person. And if you missed that announcement, you can find the link to that in our YouTube description below this video. Now, if you're not local to the Raleigh-Durham area, or if you are and it's still best for you to join online for whatever reason, we'll still be back here next Sunday with a new online experience released at 10 a.m. Sunday morning as well. Today, though, I want us to go back to a story that we find at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry life. And it's a story that I always find interesting and with lots of layers because there's a lot of context implied that many first century readers would have easily understood, but that we can easily miss a couple thousand years later. But the story starts this way in Matthew chapter 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. So, we have to pause there for a moment because there's some things worth addressing up front. First, it's worth acknowledging that this just sounds weird, right? I mean, you have Jesus being mystically led out into the desert by God's Spirit. He hasn't eaten food in 40 days, and it sounds like he's been set up to be tempted by the devil. So again, it's just a weird beginning to a story. Now, when it comes to the devil character, we can probably all agree that we're not talking about a red guy with horns and a pitchfork, right? But regardless, what we find, this personification of temptation, is we find this personification of evil. And however you view it, the common ground that we should all find is that we get the internal struggle of wrestling with all sorts of different types of temptations. And most biblical scholars would agree that this interaction between Jesus and the tempter isn't something that if video cameras existed back then you could have captured on film, but rather in this period of extended fasting for 40 days. It's more likely a type of mystical vision, a dream, or some altered state of consciousness that Jesus has. Which, understand, that doesn't make it any less than in any way. It doesn't make it something to be dismissed. As the modern sage Dumbledore once said to Harry Potter, "Of course it is happening inside your head, Harry. But why on earth should that mean that it's not real?" Now, as we look further into this story, for some of us, even if nothing else clicks today, perhaps it's just good to be reminded that Jesus was tempted. Some of us have often found ourselves struggling with various temptations, and for the longest time, we've been beat up and held hostage by thoughts like, well, you know what? If I was really a good person, or if I was someone who took faith seriously, then I wouldn't even really be considering this. I wouldn't even think twice about it. And it's been this kind of cloud of shame that constantly hangs over your head. And so perhaps it's simply good to be reminded in this story that Jesus himself was tempted. In fact, later on in the New Testament, it says that Jesus was tempted in every way. And so understand, whatever we wrestle with, you and I aren't alone here. We aren't the only ones to have ever gone through this. That's because being tempted is part of being human. It's how we process and think through temptation that is so critical. It's what we choose to be awake to in the midst of temptation that greatly affects our choices and decisions. Now, one more thing worth addressing up front is that the author Matthew, he's going to be drawing all sorts of parallels with one of Israel's most famous stories in their history. Jesus is being led by God into the desert for 40 days, just as Moses and the people of Israel were led by God into the desert for 40 years in the story of the Exodus. And just as the desert was a time of testing for Moses and the Israelites, and also a new beginning, so this will be the same for Jesus. And while we won't have time to unpack all the different references today, just know that as we look at this conversation that Jesus has with the tempter, there's a ton of context that would have been extremely familiar to first century Israelite readers, because there are all these quotes from the Exodus story in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And there's all these nods back to lessons that Israel had already learned before in their history about God and what it means to walk with God. And so if you want to dig deeper into this conversation, into the context, a decent Bible is going to have footnotes next to each of these quotes. And so you can just kind of track them down, or you should just Google it, and you should be able to find all the different context and references that this conversation is alluding back to. But let's go back to the story and look at the conversation that takes place. Verse 3 says, "The tempter came to Jesus and said, 'If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread.'" Now, there's lots of things that we could talk through here, but what I most want you to notice is how the tempter starts the conversation. If you are the Son of God. And what helps to make that even more significant is what we find just 4 sentences earlier in the letter where Matthew writes this. "As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water, and at that moment heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" So God declares about Jesus, "This is my Son that I love. I take great delight in him." Now, what's worth noting is that God declares this about Jesus before he's done any public teachings. Before he had done any miracles, before he had done any healings, before the cross, before the resurrection, before he's done any of the things that earned him that reputation. God declares, "This is who you are. You're my Son. You're loved. I take great delight in you." And so the first temptation Jesus has presented is one that starts off by casting doubt and calling his identity into question. It's, "If you are the Son of God." And that makes sense when we consider that many of our own temptations start at the same place as well. Like, why do you think anyone would ever consider you a good person? I mean, how can someone like you even claim to be interested in faith after everything that you've done? You think God could actually care about you? You think anybody could really care about you, especially if they knew this or that about you? I mean, who are you kidding? You see, often the reason we find ourselves getting caught up in destructive patterns is because we get caught up in a similar struggle where we doubt who God keeps insisting that we already are. Later on in the New Testament, there's an author, Paul, who spends the entire half of his first letter to the Ephesians. Before he offers any instructions, any commands or instructions about behavior, he says things like, You're adopted. You're part of the family. You're redeemed. You're forgiven. It's by grace you have been saved. It's not something that you've earned. It's a gift. Paul spends the whole first half of the letter before he gives any instruction insisting this is who you are. We have to start there. But often our struggle is that we think we have to earn inclusion. We have to earn love, earn grace, earn a place within the family because, again, we doubt who we already are. And so the tempter starts the conversation here in Matthew chapter 4. Before Jesus ever teaches publicly or does any miracles, by calling his identity into question. If you are the Son of God. Now, back to the conversation in verse 3. It says, the tempter came to Jesus and said, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. It's this sense of, okay, if that's who you are, prove it. Do a magic trick. After all, you're hungry. One little magic trick fixes all that. Verse 4, Jesus answered, it is written, man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Now, without context, this statement by Jesus could come off kind of ultra-spiritual and holier than thou. It almost sounds like Jesus is saying, no, thank you. I don't need any food. All I need are the words of God. But that's not what's happening here. Rather, what Jesus is doing is he's quoting from a story in the Old Testament. And by doing so, he's pulling forward all the imagery and all the lessons that Israel learned in that particular time in history. Lessons about trusting God, even in the midst of really difficult circumstances. And again, the people this was originally written to had all that context when they first read this. But it can be easy for you and I to miss that today. And we've talked about this before, but it's much in the same way if someone today referenced the phrase, I have a dream. And in the context of trying to unite people, most of us here would pull forward all the imagery and all the context of Dr. King's famous speech. But if you weren't aware of that context, the same phrase could sound out of place and confusing. So again, that's what's happening here. And if you want to dive more in, read through the Exodus story and then read through the first few verses of Deuteronomy chapter 8, and the connections will start to make a little bit more sense. But back to the conversation at hand, though. Verse 5 says, the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. So, the tempter here pulls a Bible verse out of its context from Psalm 91 and uses it like this. Okay, again, if you are the Son of God, and God is really as good as you say that God is, and if God actually cares about you, then just make God prove it. God hasn't done enough already. Just make him do more to prove it. And Jesus responds with his own Bible verse from the Old Testament. So it's kind of like this scripture jujitsu, back and forth, back and forth. Jesus says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Now, again, what Jesus is doing here is he's referencing an event from the history of the Israelites when they wandered in the desert for 40 years. Now, I'm not going to read through it all, but if you want to go back on your own, you can read through it and find it in the book of Exodus chapter 17. Because what happens is the people of Israel come to a place in the desert, and they start to demand that God prove himself, even to the point of taunting him. Are you really with us or not, God? If you're really with us, then prove it. Now, at this point in time, these are the same Israelites that God had rescued out of Egypt under the slavery of Pharaoh, the same God who had split the seas so they could walk across on dry ground rather than be slaughtered by the Egyptian army, the same God who miraculously provided food for them in the desert every day. And yet they come to this point where they find themselves demanding that God prove himself. And so their leader Moses names the place where they were when this took place Massah, which in Hebrew means test. And then later on in the Old Testament, we read this in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Do not test the Lord your God as you did at Massah. So by saying what he does, Jesus is pulling all that context and all that history forward into the present moment. Because the tempter is essentially doing the same thing. He's establishing this criteria of sorts, these hoops that the tempter insists that God has to jump through. God, I mean, if you're really God, then you'll do this. And if you don't do it, then you're not. And the thing is, we get that. Because many of us have found ourselves pondering similar things, right? I mean, God, if you're really good, then you'll do this. Or, God, if you really love me, then just do this one thing for me. Or, God, if you really exist, then just take care of this, fix this, just this one time. And if God doesn't do what we demand, if God doesn't do things how we want and when we want, when God doesn't jump through our hoops, we're tempted to conclude, well, maybe God just doesn't exist then. Maybe God doesn't really care. And over time, we just start to distance ourselves. And we feel justified in doing it because we've set up certain criteria for God to prove himself. And since God didn't prove himself on our terms, we're tempted to conclude that God is at fault. God failed. But here's the ironic thing. We can do this all the time to God, and yet we hate it when people do it to us, don't we? I mean, if you're really my friend, then you'll do this. And if you don't, then I guess we're just not really as close as I thought we were. Or if you really cared about me, then you'd. Or if you really loved me, you'd do this or buy this or let me have this, change this, whatever it is. And yet so often that's exactly what we do to God. We try to manipulate God. We treat God like God is some kind of genie, that God's power, that God's love, God's greatness is dependent on whether God meets our terms or not, whether or not God does what we say. But think about that for a moment. Who would actually be God then in that scenario? It's placing ourselves as God. You and I would be God in that scenario, right? And so here the tempter is saying to Jesus, just jump, Jesus. Make God prove it. Want to know how to make God prove it? I'll give you a plan. Just jump. After all, you trust God to bail you out, don't you? Look, even here's a Bible verse. And the same thing is often true of us. We just come up with a plan, jump, and then trust to God to bail us out. After all, if God really cares about me, the assumption is, well, God has to come through for me. And so we don't prepare, we don't study, or we make poor, unwise decisions. We put ourselves in bad situations, and then we say, God, you're going to bail me out, aren't you? I mean, after all, don't you love me, God? You're going to fix this, right? And if God doesn't do our bidding, if God doesn't meet our criteria, if God doesn't bless our plan that we came up with, the result is we can get tempted to blame God and get mad at God, get disappointed with God. And slowly over time, we just distance ourselves more and more from God or anything to do with God or do with faith, because at the end of the day, God didn't do what we wanted, how we wanted, when we wanted. Now, the tempter takes one more swing at Jesus that we see in Matthew 4. Look again at verse 8. It says, again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So at this point, the tempters tried using scripture out of context, tried to undermine Jesus' identity, tried to raise doubts about the character and nature of God. But it's like the tempter finally gets to the point where it's like, okay, forget all that. How about I just give you a lot of power and a lot of stuff right now? Let's try that. But you see, for Jesus, there's a bigger picture. There's a new kind of kingdom. There's a revolutionary way of living that Jesus is trying to usher into the world, a way marked by things like love and sacrifice and generosity and kindness, humility and grace. And often the revolution is slow. The transformation is slow. And while it comes with joy and peace, it also often comes with suffering and a need for patience and persistence. This is the path that Jesus is on. This is the path God has called him to. And so the tempter says, you don't have to walk that path. Listen, I'll give you all the power, all the stuff, all the prestige you could ever want right now. Just align yourself with me. Bow down to this way of immediate pleasure in this moment. Don't worry about how it affects others or how it affects you in the long term. This is just about you in this moment. I'm offering you a shortcut. Just say yes, and it's all yours. Jesus responds, though, by quoting yet another verse from the same ancient story of the Hebrew people. And in doing so, essentially says, no, away from me. That's not my path. That's not the story I've been called to or that I want to live. I haven't forgotten all the good things God has done. Instead, I'm going to keep trusting God. I'm going to keep trusting in this way of love and sacrifice and the way of life God points to. And then the story concludes with verse 11. It says, then the devil left him, and the angels came and attended him. So, as we reflect back on this story, I think a question worth wrestling with is, where do you and I find ourselves in these temptations of Jesus? Where do we find ourselves in this particular story? So I want to leave you with a few thoughts to ponder. When are you tempted to doubt your identity? You know, that moment where you just blew it big time, that thing that you've kept hidden, that thing that stays on repeat in your head that shames you over and over again, and the voice that you keep hearing inside your head, where it's, there's no way anyone could ever love me. If they actually knew the real me, if they'd actually known what I've done. And so maybe you find yourself trying all sorts of destructive ways to feel that feeling of love that actually devalue and degrade your own worth. Or maybe you find yourself constantly trying to exaggerate or impress people so that you can somehow earn their love, prove that you're actually worthy of love. And you've gotten caught up in this exhausting cycle, hoping no one ever finds out the truth. And you keep doubting your worth, doubting your value, when the reality is that's never in question with God. You're already enough. You already belong. You're adopted. You're family. Grace is the story you're invited into, not one of shame, not one of condemnation. Here's another question. When are you tempted to create criteria for God? Now, God, if you do this, or if you don't do this, if you show up this way, if you bail me out of this mess, if you make this person feel this way, if you make this cancer go away, if you stop this pain, if you fix this situation, then I'll know that you're good. Then I know that you care. But if you don't, I'm out. I'm done. You're a failure. Try to pay attention to those moments when you find yourself setting up criteria for God to jump through, where we find ourselves setting the terms and then holding God accountable to whatever terms we make up. And then keep in mind how much you and I hate that when someone does the same thing to us, and what it says about our own thirst for power and for control. And then lastly, when do you find yourself tempted to trade much better stories for impulsive moments that don't really lead to anything good? You see, it's in the temptation of potentially destructive impulsive moments that we have to try to discipline ourselves to ask, what kind of story do I want to tell here? With how I handle this, what kind of story do I want to tell a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now? When faced with potentially destructive, impulsive moments, we have to do the hard work of trying to reframe the moment in the context of a better long-term story, because you don't get a story of resiliency and love and commitment and character, integrity, beauty, perseverance, dedication, redemption, resurrection without fighting for those kinds of stories. Without pausing in the face of potentially destructive, impulsive moments and fighting for a better story. Because it's easy to let incredibly harmful words that you can never get back fly in the impulse of a moment and lose the long-term story of trust in a relationship. It's easy to blame others, make excuses, convince yourself you're the victim of a conspiracy when there is none, because it feels much more comforting in the moment rather than doing the hard, humbling work of taking ownership and responsibility of what you can do in a situation and focusing on those things. It's easy to trade your integrity and your character for shortcuts that you think will get you what you want and what you're convinced you deserved faster and easier. It's easy to trade your most treasured relationships for impulsive moments of escape and numbing and comfort, and lose sight of love and sacrifice and commitment and the stories that influences people long after your own lifetime. And so it's helpful for all of us to pause, to take a breath, and ask, am I giving up a much better story for something I know is far less beautiful and good? So, here's to remembering that we're not alone, that Jesus was tempted in every way himself. And here's to remembering who we actually are, that we're loved, that we belong. And as people seeking to live out the way of Jesus, here's to both offering and receiving plenty of grace, and to surrendering ourselves to being lovingly reminded along the way of the bigger, more beautiful, loving, transformative story that awaits for us beyond the temptation of the moment right in front of us. And here's to fighting for that kind of story together. You're loved, Crosspointe. Take care.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspointe.org/help.